Probably need to.
Thank you. To say that we're still in whatever stage we're at.
Don't worry, I'll sort it out, but I'll do one thing at a time.
Seems like almost disappointing. I know there are good reasons for that. But it's clear to happen here.
Thank you very much. There are a few moments where I was giving very short answers to what I've said, but and partly I'm aware that my engagement with some of the academic base and the kind of theoretical base is somewhat delayed. Done like social childhood masters or online studies, so but she isn't entirely. And I'm obviously, are you going to be afraid?
Yeah. That's cool. I'll just fix that. It's at the end of this session. What is it? I'll ask Mary to let me know before one, and then if I'll just sort it out.
Can I give you the last one?
Is that on the website?
It's probably on
You're doing this one now, in here.
I'm not reading.
You're not reading.
Not really. No,
What's the name of the programme?
No. You say this is first of all, that is quite a bit of time.
Right, I want to.
I will come in, so
I want to change the room around. Right? This is based on Tim's experience, which was the room is quite narrow here, and what we're prepared to do, if you're prepared to wait 10 minutes, is to take the screen down and put it there and work that way instead.
Okay, but I'm not actually doing the workshop, I'm just chairing it, so you're looking for Professor Phil.
Just stepped out of the room.
It's just a, would you want, I mean, if there's the numbers of people coming that were in the teams, it might be better to do. But it will mean a delay. And everybody's going to have to get up and turn around. We could play a little game, couldn't we? We could play a little game.
I don't know where it's not.
And then you go
Oh.
Nobody let me know what happened. I spent like about an hour that morning figuring out what happened in 5 minutes.
He's with me. He and I are together. We're going to move the screen.
edited version.
Morris, hold on a second. They might not. They might not want to. They might. Are you going somewhere?
Very much. It sounds horrible actually. It sounds horrible because I spoke to someone the next day and basically
The extension is
it sounds really nasty. I think it's because they were trying to get in contact with him because Carlo had set down the chair and then he just disappeared and didn't contact them back, so they in the emergency situation. And then it would give them a month or 3 weeks or however long to get back to us, and we'll send them that in email if they assume
We can take that
would
down.
belong to the committee, which I think is fair enough, but apparently they can get back in touch. But then, it kicked off the same, that Sam said that they're just...
Sure. Tech experience was the presentation was fine, this way.
In co-work, this is a good work, so I think it's
Very much and if you decide in a middle of your session, you'd like a further 10 years, I'm sure you won't.
That works for that,
I didn't work with a council or a children's centre, but it's
We need to leave. We need to speak on that.
Yeah, I did indeed.
I work with a company called Poppers, which is
Okay, we'll start.
I'm a director from the service over in Australia, I'm a host on. Yes, I did some work in last year.
Can I have your attention, please? I'm down as chairing this. However, Professor Phillips, who I've never met before, has told me it doesn't really need chairing. He's very good at his own time.
I didn't say that.
Luckily, I would have come to this anyway, because it's what I had decided to come to even before I was asked to chair. So, this is Professor Sturrock Jones. And if anyone's got anything that they think a chair needs to do that he's not doing himself, I'm sitting here.
That's good, yes. Let's have that as an agreed thing, that if you feel that it needs a bit of sharing, then put something, this needs sharing. Well, welcome. I think we've got a spare chair, so...
A chair here that we're sitting on here.
Just step forward and then there's a chair here as well. There might be some, again, maybe. Is anyone sitting here or is this somebody?
Can
you move anything over that way?
So when I was asked to talk, I guess it's partly because of my background in working with play, but very much in a utilitarian framework, because my background in children. And then increasingly I became interested in seem to have moved into the area of children's rights. So I'm not someone who is a kind of an enormous, passionate, religious convert to children's rights, and I'm not going to approach today's session in that light. Well, I was asked to do something, I think it began with C, something like a colloquium, which is a dialogue. So the way I want to work is I'm going to put some ideas into the room, and hopefully they will prove a stimulus for us to think together. One of the things I feel strongly is that for people that were in the last session I mentioned a little bit, there are very strong narratives of work within any society about what we do, how we do it, how children should be looked at and thought about. And I think sometimes we can be so deeply enmeshed in those, it's hard to take a step back and say, what's going on here? And I think for me, issues around children's rights and play are very pertinent in terms of that way of thinking. So what I hope to do in an hour and a half is to create some space for us to think together, for me to put some ideas into the room, and to hear your perspectives as people who are play workers or who are interested in play work. And I'm also aware that there's probably a wide variety of expertise and knowledge in the room, so that some people are coming fresh to issues around rights and play, and other people are old hands. So I hope to approach it in a way that will provide some stimulus for everyone in the room. So to start off with, can you just turn to the person next to you and just say what your name is to them? If you could please say your name to the Can you bring your name and exchange to the phone? I'm going to ask you to talk about these things with this partner in a short while. So here's one of the things I want to bring into the room. So rights have been around for a long time. The UNCRC is only one example of issues around human rights. That's been around since 1989. But I think in the past 25 years, things have happened, our knowledge has changed, our experiences have changed. So I suppose one of the questions I think a lot of my work is about is, can we rethink rights in the light of contemporary experiences? And I suppose in terms of the notion of change, I think it's important to see something like this, where we're in a room together, talking and thinking, as a part of how change happens. Because hopefully your ideas and thoughts will affect me, I will go on to affect other people and children that I'm involved in through research, and likewise maybe some of the ideas from today will have a knock-on effect into the practice that you're involved in with children. And I think there's a danger of something like rights and thinking around rights being something that's set in stone. And I very much want to approach rights as something that is changing and changeable. So it's not something that is a polemical position, it's something that opens up ideas and debates. So that's very much what I hope you will get from today, a sense of rights as a living experience, not something that's a set of rules and regulations. And I'm partly drawing on some writing that Sue Welch and I did, Rethinking Children's Rights, but also we've just finished, literally 3 weeks ago, some work at the Institute that I was Principal Investigator for the Office of the Children's Commissioner for England, and that was looking at teachers' views on children's rights in education. And it's not out yet, and probably I shouldn't do it, but I've brought some excerpts from what we found for us to think about together, because we've just finished processing it, so I thought I'd be interested in how you think about some of the things that we found. So to start off with, I'm going to ask you to do a little exercise. So you need a pen and a bit of paper, and I'm going to ask you to look at some images that I've culled from the web and from books about children. And one of my positions, which you touched on before, is the idea that childhood is constructed. And of course, part of what you do in play work is a deep involvement in and children in their lives. And I think playwork has a particular set of opinions about how we should treat children and how we should respond to children. And that's within a set of assumptions. So what I want to do is to open up our thinking about children's play, and this activity is a starting point for that. So I'll ask you to look at the pictures and just to note down single words that occur to you as you're looking at the pictures, and then you're going to talk about it with a partner after another short exercise. So is anyone not clear on what I'm asking you to do? I'll try. So this is part of my attempt to make it a colloquium rather than a lecture. So any words just come into your mind? Sorry for the light in this movie makes it difficult. Now, what I'd like you to do is to take one of those words that you feel comfortable in sharing with your partner, and I'd like you to create a question around that word before you share it with your partner. So choose one word, and I'd like you to create a question around that word that somehow connects with your work as a play worker or your interest in play work. So just choose one of those words, create a question around it that's around for you, that in some ways links to you and play work and working with children or being involved with children. And when you're ready, can you share that question with your partner and just talk about it a little bit?
I used to say that it was up there, there's up there, you're seeing the bit. It's interesting you both reacting to that way to that picture.
I guess quite
What the circumstances were, you see, why did he see his father, what you might have heard of this because you want to go to live. On the bench. You start thinking past what you're actually seeing actually.
Make sure each of you has some time. So make sure each of you has some time.
And a lot of times that I work with, they sort of get to know people well, and actually when they're in class, they're quite positive and happy and you never quite know what's going on for a child, but obviously you want to be
there's some countries you're commercially going to Charlie Rich on the wall, that would be not
finding or inventing something so horrible, so huge.
Can you start to bring what you say when you go Okay, can you finish what you're saying? Okay, people, can you finish what you're saying? Alright, let's just hear some of those questions, please. So let's find out what's in the room. Let's hear some of the questions that are around for you to do with children, childhood and playwork. So does anyone want to share questions?
Alfred, what should a play worker wear?
Okay. Where or where?
Where?
Okay.
Because one of the...
I kind of want you to take over and give the rest of the lecture on that theme. But just a couple of sentences. Why did you put that?
Well, one of the pictures I wrote down the word fashion. So obviously I thought fashion when I saw that picture. And I thought, well, what should a play... because you sometimes see play workers, I wouldn't use just every now and again with high heels on or something like this, they stand and they're watching them. So
well,
I just
maybe linked to that is also is how you perform the role of play worker and how you relate to the child or children. Okay. How about someone else to share their sentiments?
Based on that second photo, that girl, how much is it her choice compared to the
How much?
Is it her choice?
Okay, and so how much is it her choice and how much her parents? And what for you, again, in a couple of sentences or so, what's that around for you?
We were saying when is a child's choices, when are they valid? And sometimes they might think that frozen is absolutely the best thing and want everything they're absolutely frozen. And do we respect that because that's their choice? Do we hate Disney? Is that our choice? So just because we don't agree with their choices or they don't fit in with our agenda, when is a child's choice valid?
Yeah, and I guess again there you could say that if we think back to maybe 100 years or so ago, one of the things I sometimes do with students is we look at some of the official documentation around the children's services around 1900, 1904, and issues around children and choice seem to be not very prevalent in the way services were created or the way that provision was created. So you could say that maybe issues around choosing and choice is one of the debates that are around at the moment and has currency within parts of our culture. Okay, thank you.
And completely off subject, you've got a nasty error message.
Oh.
And I'm
Maybe that's a chair.
Give it
The warning. So it looks as if something's come out.
Yeah, the power adapter.
Good. I think I managed it. Anyone else want to share their question?
Well, I mean, it wasn't really so much of a question, but it talks about children being constructed as fragile. Perhaps, increasingly being kind of victims.
Yeah.
Yeah, what we picked up on a similar one, I don't know, that we found we both, upper play the picture of a little girl sitting on a bed with sort of her hands crossed, we both put vulnerable for that, and then, so we thought, what is it about the look of a child that makes us see them as being vulnerable?
Well, I mean, clearly, lovely, thank you. We could spend a long time thinking about the images of childhood and how they affect how we look at children in childhood. But I suppose one of the reasons I wanted to start with that was to locate the rest of my discussion in some of these questions that I've addressed in my writing and that have been around within kind of the study of childhood, which is that it's helpful, I think, to think of childhood as a particular time, but that's the way it's often constructed. And questions such as what are children like? What should they do and not do? What should childhood spaces be? And how should adults and children relate to each other? And I think in your questions that were linked to you as play workers, we can see that some of those issues are current for you too. One of the things that's been argued is that some of these things we're aware of and we're conscious of, but that other things are almost unconscious or within society in ways that we're less aware of. But that there are, at any one time, very powerful ideas at work in how children should be seen and how they should be treated. The tendency within many societies is to lump all children together, and some people have argued that within some societies there's a tendency to see children very negatively and to stereotype them as not capable or as fearful. It links to your question about choice. How can we see children? Are they able to make choices, or do they need adults to look after them and make choices for them? And I think within my lifetime we've seen an enormous shift in parts of society to do with that. From a position whereby adults made most decisions for children on things like what happened to their bodies or what their spaces should be like, to one in which there's been a shift to saying no, it's important to begin to think with children about these issues and to see them differently. So, again, this is an enormously complex area but touched on to provide a framework for where we're going to go. So, I suppose the idea is that rather than saying all children are alike, a question that develops from this perspective is that maybe there are many different kinds of childhoods, and it can be very helpful to look at those differences rather than to lump all children together. I think that's very relevant to play, for example. Another one is that the idea is that childhood is constructed by attitudes, by debates, and it's changeable. Quite often we can respond to the kinds of ideas purported by things like developmental psychology, that all children are the same and they've always been the same, and that you treat them in the same way. And I think challenges have robustly altered those kinds of ways of looking at children in certain sectors. And I think the children's rights perspective can be linked to that. So here, just put into some words of what I've just been saying really. That I think part of the frame I want us to work within in this session is the idea that there are all the time debates between us about what children are like and who they could be and how they could be. Not just through words but through actions. And that children are a part of that. That they contest, they challenge some of our ideas and respond to our ideas as well. And that I think in play work and thinking about children's rights in play work, there are very strong messages about what they should and shouldn't do and what they should and shouldn't be like. And the ways that children and young people connect to others. So it links, in both a joking way and a profound way about how you dress, but also how you behave towards children, how you relate to them in the act of play. And I know, for example, there are very different ideas about that, and certainly my position as an arts therapist working with play is strongly contested by some of the very non-directive approaches in play work, and we'll come to that later. Let's move on a little bit. Why pictures matter, and it's for people that were present in your talk. I think this is a very relevant point. Some people have argued that one of the things that have happened within the past 20, 25 years there's been a shift in services towards judgments made on certain kinds of ways of looking at outcomes, and that the importance has been placed in things like education, on testing and looking at outcomes that can be counted in particular ways, and that this picture of the way childhood is seen within something like primary education has affected the way that provision is provided. So it's not neutral. It starts to affect and inform how children experience their lives in very important ways. But there are different ways of looking at childhood, and I'm sure some of you are very well aware of this. An often cited one is the Reggio Emilia approach in Italy, for example, which places on the totality of a child's experience. So rather than looking at a segmented off area that is counted according to adult agendas, a more holistic approach is taken to childhood and to provision. So that means that one of the things that Harker has argued, that the best early years service, for example, are based on a child-centred understanding of education and care. And that's something that is deeply under fire within much of the provision in the UK. And we're just about to publish a book at the Institute in which I've charted some of the attacks from Ofsted and from the Minister for Education on child-centred ideas and provision. So you can see that these ideas that we have and that we debate and that we hold within us have profound effects on the way children are given services. And I think it's very relevant to thinking about play work and children's rights. Here's something that Harker talked about as a contrast. He said one approach, which is often cited as the outcomes-driven approach, is the image of a child as an empty vessel. And Harker challenges that, saying that it's important to see children as beings of extraordinary potential rather than vessels who need to have things poured into them by adults. So he said that within something like Reggio Emilia, those pictures of children and the idea that children should be seen holistically encourages curiosity, innovation, that children and teachers work together in a process of mutual discovery. So the child is not seen as a passive recipient, but as an active participant. And again, much to debate there. And I think a lot of people, from what I know about play work, would argue that the idea of a child as a being of extraordinary potential is something that chimes strongly with your discourses of childhood, and the images of children that you have. But within society at large, those are pictures that are not often reflected in certainly the UK provision of services.
Could I just pull you up quickly? We'll take you back to the idea of rights in relation, and the idea of children's rights in relation to both those pictures of children. The empty vessel that needs the right ingredients pouring in, or the being of immense potential, where experience needs looking at in a holistic way. My recollection is that protagonists of both those points of view of the child will equally say that they are adopting a child rights-centred approach, because the Michael Goves of this world, for example, will say that trendy lefties are ignoring children, condemning children to a lifetime of
not acting in their best
exactly, because like it's a tough world out there. Children need to shape up. We need to put the right ingredients in. And if we don't do that, we're failing children and neglecting their rights in that way. So I think it's interesting, whereas of course the proponents of the Reggio Emilia philosophy would also say that's a rights-based approach. So I just that's an interesting observation that you can the idea of rights is in kind of in a way it's neutral, is between those two philosophies of childhood. You can,
but don't forget, I've not introduced rights yet, so I've introduced a
Sorry.
critical framework. So absolutely, like I said, I'm not a passionate advocate of rights. I think it's important to maintain a critical framework, and this is part of the framework. But I think it's important to look at rights as well. And I agree, both sides can use the language of rights. I mean, what a concept I've often found useful is one of othering, and the way that majority groups other minority groups. The idea is that, let's use these two chairs as an example to help illustrate. One of the ideas that's often put forward is that majority groups tend to define how things should be seen and how things should be acted upon. And that tends to affect how people who are different are seen. And I often draw an analogy between some of the more recent ways of looking at childhood and what happened with second wave feminism. So for example, in huge parts of society before second wave feminism, issues such as services, about the way capability was thought of in terms of women, was defined by men. So women were often stereotyped as not being capable or able. And of course second wave feminism challenged those ideas profoundly, and that work is still going on, in terms of looking at a way of looking at equality in terms of men and women. And some people argue that a similar process is occurring in terms of looking at children, in that they would argue that adults have often stereotyped children in the way that adult males used to stereotype, and some still do, women. And that there is a need to challenge some of those stereotype views because they don't give an accurate picture of what children are actually capable of. And othering is a word of that process. So basically, othering is a way of, this is another framework for us to use in thinking about what we're going to go into. Othering is a process whereby a powerful majority aspect of culture others those who are different, so that they're seen in terms of deficits because they're not the same as the way that the majority look at themselves. So people would argue that adults tend to other children, so that adult ideas, adult ways of looking at things are seen as the norm, and that when children do things differently, that's seen as a deficit, it's looked at negatively. So the basic process is that that idea reinforces majority notions of identity, so that the norm is what adults do, and children in their differences are seen as inadequate in some way, rather than different. And people argue that that ensures that the minority group are marginalised, so they're pushed away, so that they're denied in some ways, and they're disempowered, and it reinforces the idea that they're outsiders, and that results in stigmatising and being seen as different or inadequate. So some people would argue that because children don't communicate in the same way that adults, because children's agendas for what they want in their life is different from adults, that's not seen in a way that is looked at benignly within society. It's looked at as problematic or as a deficit, or as it's ignored. And I think play fits into that. And I think when we come to look at and think about children's right to play, it could be interesting to think of this idea that the majority culture, who hold ideas about what is good, what provision should be like, how funding should be provided, tend to other or distance children. So that's another critical framework. But let's start to move into some of the details now. So, again, part of what I'm saying is that maybe one of the ways that adults stereotype children is seeing them as not capable. And that reinforces adult ideas that children should be dependent upon children to act for them. So rather than seeing them as capable, as agents in their own right, they need adults to make decisions for them. So let's straight back to what you were saying about choice. So whether they can be seen as active participants rather than people who need to be looked after and provided for by adults who make the best kind of decisions for them. Now, let's start to think about children's rights. So I've given you some ideas. So if the idea is that, one of the ideas I put forward is that childhood is constructed and that we look at it in certain kinds of ways, maybe we can say the same thing as rights. Remember what I talked about before, of not looking at rights as this set in stone list of things that you must do, but that it's part of the way we live, part of the way we work, part of the dialogue between us. This is a picture of a child's rights ecology model. So because the lighting is so abominable in this room, I'll describe it to you. You can see the basic shape. What it has through the middle is child, family and peers, and then that kind of runs through the idea of children's rights running through with all these different layers, with the child at the top. Now, talk to your partner. If you were reading this, saying, well, what picture of rights does that show? What's it saying about how children are seen? So have a talk with your partner. That's a version of how we can look at children's rights. What do you think it says? I don't particularly like it, so I'm not encouraging you to like it. But talk to your partner. What's that saying about children's rights and society?
Personally, I don't know.
Well, I suppose because at the end of the day, because it's like that, I feel that it's so high, you go from one level to the next, so it's so actually at the bottom right now is actually I think that's why being a child in a different space on the whole. You're bringing kind of othering the child that makes it different than the child family kids. The way they're separated
It's a bit longer. What are your thoughts about this? I'm not looking for an agreement in the room. I'm just interested in the way people think of this image of children's rights. So, what people's thoughts? What do you talk about?
What does it say at the bottom? Can you just tell me
What, that bottom row?
Yeah.
Non-discrimination.
Someone's got a very good eyesight. I'm going to have to go right up.
What?
Action in the best interest of the child.
Life
Survival and development.
Well, I'm interested.
It's the purple part, isn't it?
But what, as an image, what do people think about that as a way of looking at children's rights?
It's very hierarchical.
Yeah. Tell us a bit more.
Well, one thing it does, going back to your framework, the idea about kind of othering the child, it separates, puts the child on the top, and as a kind of a separate, as a kind of a isolated, if you like, isolated.
They're separated off.
They're separated off, kind of the other kind of situation, and I think it puts a lot of. It doesn't. Tomorrow, I think you look at anything in context. I think context is very important when looking at children's rights.
So it's like a jelly separated off from the world.
Yeah, for
Okay,
sure.
thank you.
Yeah.
How about for other people? Again, I'll not for consensus.
Well, I just thought it looks like it's the pinnacle of everything, but on the other hand, it's the least important because it's the smallest. So it has atom top.
Turn it upside down. I said, do you read it from the bottom up or the top down?
Okay. Yeah. So it's a sense of it not quite fitting together, linking to your point as well.
Yeah, because my immediate thought was you turn it upside down and you actually get a better picture of what that actually means to the child, because all the rest is on the top and the child's at the bottom.
And it makes a great spinning top as well.
I'd put it to that thought, it was all coming into the centre and then turning it up to the child.
So in a way that's quite a nice, maybe a nicer version of that. I suppose what I'm trying to show you here is linked to the idea that things are constructed in certain ways and we make choices about them. So there's a particular interpretation of children's rights. I've not even said what they are yet, but I'm approaching it deliberately from this way. Let's have a look at another attempt to construct a picture. Here's one from the Welsh Government. And again, I'm sorry, I'll read you some of these. It's got children's rights in Wales at the middle, and you can see there are arrows, and I'll just give you a selection of it. It's got children and young people, NGOs, children's rights impact assessment, making children visible in budgets, monitoring and reporting, awareness raising and dissemination of the UNCRC. So again, not getting too much worried about the detail in there, but what do you think of that as an image? Let's be readers of this image in terms of how it's picturing children's rights. What do you think of that one?
Maybe the arrow should be around the other way.
Well, have a chat to your partner first.
It's about it's a network of institutions and forms of action which together mesh together to children's rights of the well, it's essentially, if you are a person who's concerned
Okay, next thing. A bit like we read the pictures of children. This is a government's attempt to say how it's thinking about children's rights. So what were people's responses to this image? What were your thoughts?
Because children's rights, in the centre and surrounding, so I think it is a very particular, very specific perspective on rights in children, almost being. I would question just think: do the different pink boxes buffer children's rights from perhaps the wider context and other rights, perhaps?
So you could say that one of the things, I think, from what you're saying is that whereas I was saying before, this process of othering sets children apart and away, that image tries to almost reverse that and put them at the centre rather than being othered and set apart by majority adult concern.
Yeah, but also puts them on a par with monitoring and reporting, though, doesn't it? So it's not actually a very useful, in my view, diagram, in that actually it kind of avoids any kind of hierarchy. So you could describe some of those people as like stakeholders, and then you could have started, and then so you've got stakeholders, you've got NGOs, children, young people, whether or not who's more important or not, fine. Then we've got monitoring, reporting, making children visible in badges. I'm not just showing off my eyesight also. And which are a kind of series of aspirations or techniques.
So you're saying that it's
I think it's weak actually.
It's an image that doesn't give a sense of action in terms of, you're saying it lacks hierarchy.
Well, yeah, I mean, if we're talking about hierarchies, like, it would be more useful to have a hierarchy in that if we were going to make a kind of big point out of it.
Again, like I said, I'm not advocating these images, I'm just saying, let's look at them and think about them. Anything? Thank you for that.
On a positive note, sounds anyway, children in budgets, if children aren't visible in budgets, if you haven't got a budget heading, you're not going to have them. In terms of being looked after or provided for or given a service or something.
So are you saying that at least in that it makes them visible?
Yeah, it's meant sort of, hopefully you think that that's got an action plan off of it. That's one piece of paper, and there's another piece of paper that says how are we going to do this, which policy is going to stand strongly enough that you get a budget heading for it.
So maybe one of the things we're taking of that image, in terms of the intentions of the government to produce that, is they want to make it visible in areas like the provision of budgets. Okay, thank you. And you have a point.
Well, I was going to say, still very much another in that whoever's in the centre is saying, these are the rights, this is how we're showing that we're following those rights.
Yeah.
These are the rights we're giving to the children, not there's no children's voice coming back in that.
Well, and again, I think that's a very nice point. And I suppose one of the issues for me as well, which I think builds on your point, is that all of these arrows don't really connect up, and they're one way. But I think one of the things we can say is it's very hard to create a picture of children's rights. But I suppose what, again, I'm trying to show you is that it's not something that's monolithic. It's constructed in certain ways, and by looking at these images, I think it's a helpful way to start to think about, well, how are rights approached? They're not neutral, they're not only something that can be thought about and acted on in one way. So let's start to explore them in a bit more detail. Just for people that don't know so much about rights, the UNCRC is only one example of rights that affect children and childhood. Just to note, there's the European Convention from 1950 and the Human Rights Act, which again you know that the coalition government has had a lot of issues with, makes most of the rights and freedoms in the European Convention part of the law. Just to note that. So it's part of a raft of a set of intentions. And at the moment it stands at 54 articles, and those are often divided popularly into provision, so that children's rights to certain kinds of provision, protection from abuse and exploitation, and participation in decision making. But this isn't a lecture about rights. I'm just showing you a little bit of background, and here's the text of something I'm sure you're familiar with, of Article 31. So just read that to familiarise yourself with it again. So let's start to think about this critically. Here's some thoughts. So some basics. A right is often defined as a protected exercise of choice. Often attached to rights are the idea it's not just about rights, it's about responsibilities. So that children in relationship to the UNCRC and in relationship to Article 31, it's not just about saying they have a right to play, it's looking at what responsibilities they have within that process. And also, often linked is the idea that if someone has a rights holder, someone else is a duty bearer. So a child might be the rights holder of Article 31, but it means that society has the duty to provide that right. So that's the basic, but let's get more complicated.
Which is a political statement, and I think it's a normative statement.
Let's get started on this. Just to note that the UK ratified, that means that they recognised it in 1991, but it's not often known, but I always make a point of saying it, they asked for specific children to be left out. So the children that they said were not deserving of rights were the children of people seeking asylum and for immigration. So they specifically asked for those children to be left out. So the reason I'm introducing that is the idea that not all children have been given access to the UNCRC by our governments, and that the way in which they're interpreted, which goes straight to your point, is a political issue, which I'm sure you're all aware of. But let's examine that and see what we can draw from that. Now, this is the way rights often happen, and it goes from international, it's an international convention, it goes into the national arena for ratification, and that's interpreted locally, and then in the immediate circle of children's workers and families and then to the child. But I think this is where you were going by your comment before. More recently, people have begun to say it's part of this way of looking at childhood is that children should have a voice in what their rights are and how they're interpreted. So that there's been work whereby children have looked at the UNCRC, have critiqued it and developed their own version. And I know that there's been work done in that area to do with how children look at their right to play, for example. But, let's show you another diagram. And sometimes these relationships are not easy, they're contested and problematic. So I gave you an example of whereby the international perspective from the UNCRC said that all children should be given the rights described in the UNCRC, and the English government said no, we don't agree, there are children we don't think are deserving of those rights. So that was an example of that. That's where it's overversed, but I think there are covert ways in which governments resist and contest and underpin or either support rights or make sure that those rights don't happen really. And those are affected by the kinds of issues we've touched on, which is why I think it's important to be aware of the debates that happen between us about how we see children and how we see childhood and how adults and children relate to each other. And those are the cultures within our society. And play, and the position of play, and the right to play is very much a part of that process. And as I think we saw in the last session, I'm sure you're aware of, this is not something that's established, it's something that's important to think about because it's a process that we're still within. Let's have a look at some of the ideas in the play return. In the broad conclusion section, the play return, for those of you who don't know it, really took a good look at some of the ways in which evidence to do with play is thought about and the way it's been researched so far, and helpfully communicated what some parts of research shows us what we think we know. And one of the ways it does it, and I don't know, it'd be interesting if you later, I don't know now whether this was intentionally or not, was it tended to separate off benefits and rights. And it makes a very good point. This is a quote from you, lovely point. Evidence does not exist in a vacuum. It needs to be seen in the light of values and understandings about what matters and what is worth measuring. It's a deeply important point. And it says, there is a debate to be had about whether policy and practice should be based on outcome-orientated frameworks or whether they should be based on other rationales for supporting play, including rights-based approaches. Now, okay, bear that in mind. Here's another little quote from it I want us to look at. Now, in the outcomes, the language of benefits is used. So I'll just read this out. Play initiatives lead to improvements in children's physical and mental health and well-being and are linked to a range of other cognitive and social developmental benefits. Families and communities also benefit from play initiatives. There is enough empirical evidence for policymakers to be confident that initiatives that lead to improved play opportunities will also reliably lead to the wider benefits discussed in this report. And I'm a huge fan of those points. I think it's important knowledge. However, it's interesting to think about that word that crops up, benefit. I'm going to ask you to think about that. Because one of the things the report says is it offers us those benefits, and then it says other rationales for supporting play, including rights-based approaches, including that. Now, have a talk to your partner. I've highlighted those terms for a particular reason, because I think it represents something about societal attitudes, which I think you're aware of in writing the report. What do you think it shows? And why might that be quite a tricky thing for play work? Okay, have a talk to your partner.
Would you like?
Why don't I take notes?
The need to constantly justify the education of children in terms of various other social values, whether that's to do with private action, help out council, better education, and it's very tempting to go back and look and again, this stuff doesn't matter, whether it's good for children or not, it's widely accepted that children have a right to a decent play, and that in itself is not justification for health.
Just a little bit longer.
But in the particular reason, that's not if you want to justify the spending of public resources, then you have to be willing to sort language politicians and justify why tax funds should be spent on event playgrounds rather than something else.
Now, so if you've not read the play return, I've given you the reference to find it there, and I strongly encourage you to read it. And if you want a copy of my PowerPoint with these details in, just give me your details and I'll email it to you. But thinking about this, why do you think that might be, or you might say not, but I mean I think it's quite a tricky thing for play workers. What do you think might be a bit tricky or complex about this?
Well, it partly to do with how most play settings apply for funding, is that you need to show those developments and you need to show them in that societal way. Whereas if you just go harping on about rights, it's not understood in the same context. But actually, if you could provide for all those rights, you'd actually probably be giving all those benefits anyway.
Okay.
Well, I've got like a school club, so I'm trying to have funding for myself, and I've been, it's a school club. So we do quite risky things and all that, and we seem to get a lot of misunderstanding from, shall we say, neighbours and this sort of thing about the way the play is being conducted. And so, they have a much stronger, they write letters and things like this about us. There's a child who's saying, I'm loving it here, doesn't write letters about it. It's getting the neighbours and the wider community to realise that this is a good thing that's going on. Not necessarily just in my setting, but in other settings. And that maybe it should be in the streets as well.
Thank you.
From my point of view, when I'm going in and trying to sell my programme, say to a school, I've tried all different approaches, and I've tried the rights approach. But ultimately, decision makers are quite selfish. And what sells play to them is what will make their life easier or deliver the outcomes that they are under pressure to deliver. So I say a great playtime will mean that your teachers can teach more effectively after playtime. They'll go with my project. If I say my project will deliver your legal obligation to provide under Article 31, they'll just look blankly at me and say, in so many words, yeah, and so what? So I think we have to be realistic in terms of, yeah, we want to do the right thing. Other people kind of want to do the right thing, but given the different pressures on them, actually what they want is stuff to make their life easier.
Okay.
I mean, a longer term benefit is much harder to quantify for less interesting for government control. Realistic, cynical level, you want to see that things have improved in a quantifiable sense. Well, why you get something from a collection rather than say it's just a better thing for the good of 50 to 100 years rather than the next 5.
So this was part of what I'm picking up in the room is a sense of this language represents the realistic environment within which play work is happening. Let me ask you a different question, but it's related. I mean, and I think Tim has an implicit awareness of this in terms of the way he framed it. Why do you think what do you think it shows about our society, part one, and two, could it be different, that these are seen as other sets of rationales rather than being linked together? So have a chat to your partner about that. I think that word other.
If you go back to the human rights oriented human rights, and human rights has actually been a concept since way back in the 18th century. There's that whole way of thinking about the world with disorders, and still in societies that still regard proper human life is fitting in with the scheme provides based on supernatural which is still the way that some kind of people do their thing. So at the same time it is I don't really know the history, so my understanding is that the people who do it, like we say, the very concepts of the environment, they base it on what they thought was the nature of the individual.
Okay, can you bring what you're saying to a close?
So to that extent, benefit in terms of
So, what's the story about the use of the word other,
there shouldn't be
and
any
whether
a clash,
Tim was
because they are
indicating
ultimately
something we can think
drive
of?
the same point. But
What people's thoughts?
I think Tim was having to kind of navigate his way through the tension between instrumental and intrinsic value, and within a sector that can't even kind of agree on that itself, and also speaking to an audience that the minute we start talking about intrinsic value, we just kind of get laughed out of the room. So he's trying to navigate that journey, but in doing so, he's relegated the rights of the child to an other rationale, which could be seen as being secondary to the benefits on the left-hand side.
I mean, I think that's a very interesting one. My interpretation was reading into your mind was that you were noting that division. So I don't think, to me, it wasn't separating out. You were drawing our attention to it. I mean, how about other people?
yeah. I think the point you made earlier about responsibility bearers is really key in this, because all sorts of people say, children have a right to play. No problem. We're not stopping children from playing. We admit they have a right to play. What does that mean in terms of our responsibility to help make that happen? How far does that go? Whose responsibility is it? I mean, in the case of the gentleman around there talking about his after-school club and neighbours objecting, then the neighbours who are objecting have maybe are responsibility bearers in tolerating certain sorts of behaviour which they prefer not to tolerate. But if the neighbours in fact are not bearing that responsibility in a way that acknowledges the right of children to play in that context, what agency's further responsibility is it to kick those neighbours up the bum and say, look, you need to be paying more attention to children's rights to play here. So the rights approach on its own doesn't actually get you all that far in terms of responsibility because the enablement of play to happen, it's a very diffuse thing. It's partly about physical resources and money, but it's also very largely about attitudes and feelings and values, and it's also about sort of social institutions which on the face that have nothing whatever to do with play, but which nevertheless constrain children's lives and environments to a substantial degree. So I think in that context, you have to go on and look at and refer to the benefits and say, okay, underlying this there's a right, but when we look at what's actually happening in children's lives, if certain things happened, the benefits to those children and to certain other stakeholders would be identifiably greater. So certain sorts of action are needed, which certain sorts of actors then need to take. So I think you really have to go on to look at benefits, because rights on their own, they're a kind of a substratum, but on their own they don't get you very far.
Okay, thank you. That's a very valuable point. I guess one of the worries that if I was a play worker for here, which again I think is part of what Tim's picking up on, is the danger of those becoming separated out and that becoming other. Because my sense of having supervised play work to PhD level is that the non-directive qualities of play work, the ways in which the child's agenda is worked with, might be compromised if a divorce starts to happen between those two. So let's think a little bit more about that.
Can I just
chip
in? Because it seems to me that the worry I have about only talking about benefits or beneficial outcomes is that children are pictured as solely being the kind of receptacles that hold these future outcomes.
Yeah.
So our only interest in this child or this group of children is in kind of how what we do makes something or other better. And we lose sight of the idea of them being human beings who have...
You've telepathically read my next quote from my colleague.
I think that is a real danger, and
Yeah.
it's, by the way, not just a danger about in relation to children, of course, it's a danger in relation to wider debates about utilitarianism and instrumental ways of thinking about policy. Just very quickly on to say, I think one of the rationales for taking the approach we did in this report is that for 15, 20 or possibly 30 or 40 years, the play movement sector really, or of course, has been trying largely unsuccessfully, although not entirely, but largely unsuccessfully, to make arguments and make the case on a kind of rights-based framework, and hasn't talked very much at all about outcomes. Now, there's a good reason for that. It is difficult, but I think that was partly, which is a different way of saying what Tom said.
Yeah. Oh, can I move on? Can I just square time? Absolutely, and I think our thought process is going in a parallel direction. One of the things that Don Wise has said that quite often, well, let me say something first. One of the things that I think we tend to find in the way that things are covered by the media and by policy in this country is if there is no alternative. I touched about that earlier, about why pictures matter, to help us stand away and think about this. It needn't be like this. And I think what's been called the schoolification of childhood is a very profound thing in UK society. And the ways in which outcomes are interpreted in particular ways and used with a push of funding to affect how childhood is seen. And I think one of the things that Dom is trying to draw attention to here is that quite often part of what happens is that the two are separated off. So that instead of combining a notion of a rights-based approach with one that looks at benefits, that looks at understanding of how change can happen for children, is those are separated off and the benefits are taken over by certain sets of agendas. And I think that's another version of what you were both saying. So rather than looking at children as individuals with enormous potential, they're looked at in terms of needs which adult agendas can serve. And that soon turns into children need adult agendas, and that's what their lives are going to be to do with. Now, I think that does pose a problem for play work, because I think there is a danger about that potential split between a focus on benefits and issues around the right to play.
We have to remember that play work is an adult agenda, isn't it, as well?
For sure, yeah. Absolutely.
I was with Shelley, we're advocates for children, so we should be fighting their cause.
Well, absolutely, and that's a very complex thing. But let me take you on one bit further. Yeah. This is one of the things that Mike Ragg wrote in our book, The Children's Right to Play. When play is made a priority, it is only ever revealed in terms of the instrumental role in achieving more important adult agendas. As the only truly child-centered profession, play work adopts a distinct perspective on children's rights. Sorry, I started wrong. It works solely with the child's agenda. I don't believe that. But I think that it's an important philosophical position to strive for. So, let's move on, because I think it does relate to what we talked about as a possible dichotomous difficulty, the splitting that might be tricky for play work. So, again, how do you respond as an individual in terms of your own attitude towards play work, in terms of what Mike is saying there?
I mean, we don't have a child's agenda, we have a play agenda, don't we? I think it's a slightly different thing.
Say a bit more?
I don't know, I just think that's where we're at with our own adult agenda, is that, we're in play, we're in the value of play, and providing that, and we're putting it out like that.
Yeah, it's impossible to be neutral, but you're making certain kinds of choices, I imagine. So how do you see the certain kinds of choices you make in relationship to them?
Well, I think you're saying that plays an aspect of children's lives, not all of children's lives.
Possibly, yeah.
And you're advocating for that aspect of children's lives to be valued.
But if you just look at children's lives, it is about play in a more general philosophical sense as being an essential attribute of being human.
I mean, what do you think about what he says here about adult agendas and the instrumental role of the child's agenda? I mean, how do you respond to that, given some of the things we talked about to do with that issue of benefits and the other way of looking at things?
I don't think that we work solely with the child's agenda at all. I think we have a sort of stereotype playwork child, just the same as there are other stereotype children, and that I think you're right. We work with the play agenda as opposed to and hope that the children are going.
Which is our adult agenda as well.
It's an adult agenda.
Well, maybe we're in danger of essentialising play workers when we should say there are lots of different kinds of play workers constructed in particular ways, but there are tensions they all hold in common, and it's how you work with that. So again, I'm not looking for an answer here, I'm just holding this up, like I said, as a space for us to think together and share views on this. What are other people's experiences about their construction of play work and play working?
I don't know, is it that...
Sorry, can we have someone here then? Yeah, go on.
I was going to say, is it that most of us working with play try to get feedback from the child by observing them, but also sometimes asking them what it is that they want within, at least within the framework that we provide as a play setting. So, I don't know.
So in a way you're saying that partly you're thinking about participation rules. That provides a language for understanding part of what is important for you about how you construct what a play worker's role is. How about for you?
I'll just say there's sometimes a barrier, I think, in understanding what the child actually wants, so that the adult's sort of interpretation of how to find out what the child wants to do in their play, or to understand. It's like, so whether you have like a board of post-it notes and they write down what they want to do next week, and things like that, or how do we actually come about understanding what the child actually wants to do, and then come up with a plan.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so again, there I think you're using the idea of communicating with the child to have a shared agenda in dialogue, not making yourself invisible and saying I'm just working with your agenda, but looking at that in dialogue. Okay, let's take that idea of a possible set of dangers with this relationship between benefits and children's rights. What do you think the dangers for your field or the field of play work might be by separating them out, or by that separation? What do you think the dangers for the field could be? Okay, have a talk to your partner. This is a thinking space, so I'm inviting you to think.
I'm not very quick on this.
There is a split, or there should be, or there's a danger.
Well, so the only time any time for play, especially broadcast in terms of action, is when it's serving some non-play agenda. So that when people are doing better play, especially the questions about dangers in separating benefits based on action, well, until if you bang on about children's rights, then it's sort of saying is that we're going to alienate or at least fail to interest people of the so yes, but so what?
Let me put a couple more things your way to think about. Can you pause in terms of what you're saying? Can you just pause for a moment? Let me add this. If you haven't read it, it's a very interesting thing for play workers to read. In 2013, the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child issued a general comment to clarify governments about the importance of Article 31. And I think there's much there that you could use, as well like you were doing, as a language to help you think about why you do what you do in particular ways. So it says, one of the criticisms it makes is that for governments, when investment is made in the provision of structured and organised activities, but equally important is the need to create time and space for children to engage in spontaneous play, recreation and creativity. Again, look at what's happening. It's a division, a splitting. And again, I would suggest that maybe there's a danger here for the future of play work within that division and splitting. So just hold on to that and I'll make one more point. Yeah. One of the things that some governments are doing, and I think the Welsh and the Scottish governments are trying, I'm less convinced that the English government is doing, are to actually implement Article 31. And I know that practicing and thinking about play work for those of you in England can be quite depressing because of the splits in the way that funding is happening. But I thought, again, you may very well be aware of this, but it might be interesting to look at things like the poverty strategy for Wales and the children and families measure for 2010. In terms of, again, part of what the field of play work does is to lobby politically, which you were talking about. And I think these are very interesting for us to hold in our minds, that it can be different, that it's not just all about instrumental funding. So, look at that. You've got in section 11 a duty on local authorities to assess and secure sufficient play opportunities for children in their area. The play sufficiency duty comes as part of the Welsh Government's anti-poverty agenda, which recognises that children can have positive experience, opportunity and aspiration, and this can affect children from different social, cultural and economic backgrounds. So there I think you've got the idea that I think it's important to hold on to, which is that these ideas can affect policymakers, and it's useful, even though change can take a long time and you're looking at the short and the long-term effect of this, are useful to have. But let me go back to the previous slide, if I can do that on this machine.
Can you not go back on this?
Oh. Yeah. Oh, does that work? Okay, let's try that. I can probably do it this way. That's fine. If you just let go, that'd be great. Thank you. Okay. Let's go back to this. I've suggested that there's a danger here for play work in its future. Let's spend some time thinking about this. And I really, there are some other areas I wanted to go into, but I think I'd rather spend some time thinking about this with you. What do you think some of the dangers might be of this kind of separation, which you've identified within your discussions and within your lived experience of funding and working with play work? So you talked about this in your pair a little bit. What are people's thoughts about possible dangers here to play work?
Well, I don't think that if you're going to get all this money being given to people like a local authority, will they be building, tennis courts? Will they lose focus on the big area of playing the tennis courts? Maybe some of these, prefabricated play spaces where you've got the concrete tower there.
So it might be around agendas about how money is spent and funding is allocated. Yeah.
Well, is there a possibility that we'd end up creating spaces for particular types of play because they show outcomes rather than spaces where you can have spontaneous play that actually has no outcomes other than your child enjoying themselves.
This is
Well, this isn't quite what's captured in that contrast you've highlighted, but I know I don't know if there's anyone from Wrexham here, but I know in Wrexham they've been looking at how they, as an authority, unpack that duty that's been imposed, and that they've been trying to engage with children in meaningful ways and find out from children what is stopping them from having good play opportunities, and the kind of barriers they've been identifying haven't been about lack of play areas or facilities, they've been about things like adult attitudes and traffic. And so their response has been, or as I understand it, is to try and tackle those barriers, not invest in shiny things that politicians like to invest in. But I'm tripping up a bit here because that's slightly different from the kind of structured and organised activities. Because for playworkers here, structured and organised, bell it rings is sports and arts and crafts, and rather than freely chosen, intrinsically directed, blah blah blah. And that's a slightly different point to the point that the Wrexham people are making, which is about let's not just get preoccupied with provision, let's look at opportunities.
Well, because also for me that connects up with what we've been talking about to do with societal attitudes as well.
Yes.
Because what you've just talked about there is children identifying adult attitudes that preclude or oppose their access to certain kinds of play. How about for other people with this division?
Yeah. Well, the other thing that it kind of almost cynically suggests that this could be kind of utilised in terms of kind of a neoliberal agenda for separating what might be the publicly funded arena for children to play and the continued move into kind of private realm of, for example, the spontaneous play. So again, kind of putting further divisions into what is public, what is private, the role of the public sector.
Or
Sorry, go on.
a slide further, you're taking people out of it altogether, because an actual person organises something, structures something, whereas spontaneous in a recreational ground or I don't know, inspired by something creative you see around you takes the person out of it altogether. So why do you need to put money and thinking and budget to something that if it's a better design it might all work on its own?
No, I was going to say the big challenge for us as a play work sector is the free play agenda, because structured, if we go more down the road of structured organised activities, even if they're done in a sort of play work, child-centred kind of way, I think authorities and private providers put a price tag on it, and certainly the work we've been doing in the North East with our sports department now, we've taken over children's play, is to make the case for free play, and that also comes into the domain of the family as well. Families actually, a lot of families are happy to play, so they pay for this, pay for that, and it's actually the free play opportunities that I think becomes a big campaign, and I think you can make that, you can advocate for free play, but you have to take on board the child's right, the needs of the child, and the benefits as well, and put them all into the mix, but keep firmly on track actually that we want free play opportunities. And when you look on some of the policy pictures that you put in early on, and you can draw from the language of the early years, that early years intervention. That's what we need. We need investment from the government, from charities, or from wherever, in intervention strategies that are about children's free play, which isn't paid for.
Thank you.
And that employs their workers.
Well, as a matter of principle, Jackie, if not practice, can I challenge you on that? Because I think there's a real danger in equating children's rights to play with more play workers. I mean, it's absolutely not the same thing. Play workers are only necessary because children have lost their freedom to play. If there was a society in which children were genuinely free to play in terms of traffic, adult attitudes, etc., then play workers would be very much less necessary.
So you're broadening the point.
Well, what I'm saying is that let's not equate the achievement of children's right to play, or indeed the achievement of positive play outcomes for children, with the employment of more play workers. I'm for that as much as anyone else, but let's be clear what we're.
But again, in terms of time, so I hope some of the things I've helped happen in this room is to show you how issues around children's rights and thinking about rights is not about something that's set in stone. It's very much a live thing. I also hope I've shown that by looking at childhood as constructed, by looking at rights as constructed, we can see that they're not something that, again, is fixed in stone, but are changeable. And play work holds on to some very powerful issues within society as a whole to do with childhood, to do with play, and there are very powerful arguments at work that are challenging some of the basic tenets of play work. I suppose what I wanted to get across to you in my talk was a concern about that potential split between a benefits agenda and a more rights-oriented one being seen as other, because I think there's a very powerful case for dialogue between them in certain ways. But I suppose also to do with the ways in which a pernicious change can happen in the way a profession is looked at. That your profession is constructed. We talked about that too. It's not just useful to look at childhood as constructed, but play workers are constructed. And we saw in this room, you each have different ways of thinking about how play work happens and who you are as a play worker. But in the face of arguments that are strongly opposed to the right to play and that strongly advocate provision of children as being to do with adult agendas and benefits, cutting off from children's world, that can easily affect how a profession sees itself. And that because you're funded in certain ways, because you're taught to supply or encouraged to supply in certain ways, that can start to affect how a profession sees itself and understands the role of the adult, the role of the child, and the nature of play. And I suppose I suggest that you are in the midst of a cultural battle, a cultural battleground around this. And these are important issues to think about and hold. So I hope I've helped you focus on that a little bit, to see something that is present and given some space for you to think about it, which I hope will permeate through other discussions outside this room. So thank you very much for the pass down. Thank you. If you want a copy of the PowerPoint, please just write your name and email address on the back of this, and I'll send it to you in the next few days. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh yeah, no, that's fine. By the way through. It's a long version.
I remember talking about it 3, 4, maybe 5 years ago. I do a strategic program at schools. I'm based in the southwest, but I work all over the country. Yeah, 130. I'm not sure. Improvement service for the council.
To start from there,
It's interesting.
you know, to move to take the train and move and I think that's all got to show is
Even if it's just a case of signposting and not funding.
That's great, thank you very much.
We work with schools all over the country. And the program itself
and but
has been
the thing that
evaluated with
happens
this
there
report.
is that
Tim's
attitude
report.
In what way?
Had two
he's always employed and he's top of the grade and I
so what it is,
because I've heard of the education and it was when the Icelandic law
and it's a very structured program to support schools strategically plan for the improvement of play, the same way that they would
I mean, even before, my attitude to risk, you get children's attitude to risk, just not known. That's why in the afternoon, the light, with all the issues from the other side, you didn't know what the kids were going to be very different. A long time ago, they were looking at age the unfit, all the stuff, how much it then thinking process. I think the big thing was being and we did a based on the Borough Council as well, this question of admin to say.
And the pitch to schools is really that players already
that we felt the borough needed.
One day a week,
And people needed
1.4 years out of 7. And it already has a budget of 20 to 25 a year.
Not any look Thank
you. So we look at everything. We look at the policies, the attitude towards risk and risk benefit, the communication with parents, the staffing structure. We set up the working company, so we have a representative from FNC, teaching body, program body.
You say back to London?
Yeah.
Did you work
Play champion governor.
Yeah.
Maybe
I'm not that
very
happy.
and we try to get the teachers ongoing program and getting to think about 5 action plans, building play, so that it becomes embedded in what we do and not some PPA projectors.
People just going out and having this okay,
Yeah.
thank you for coming back. It's my third one actually, because it's not a good time to get back for 3 days. Mill Street. Weird room, isn't it? What was it?
We're looking at children's rights.
Oh, right. Oh, yes.
And follows on from
this. Oh, I know this.
Yeah. What's your name on the
Phil James.
what's your name on the Wendy works at Gloucester University playwright lecturer.
All right.
I just did an amazing presentation with lots of people on play, social and psychological necessity, but also 10 minutes did you do at the end? Different perspectives on play.
10 minutes.
10 minutes of play in 10 minutes. A really good debate. So are you Phil?
Yeah.
Oh, hello.
Oh.
Nice to meet you. Worked with Peter Hoffman at the London Institute.
Yeah.
We've spoken on the phone, haven't we? When you last saw.
Oh, gosh, we have, yes.
Yeah. But I haven't actually met you.
No. That's what makes it a famous name. Face to famous name, sorry.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I've got to scoot back, so... nice to meet you.
What's in here, Andy? What's in
Well,
here? Bob's got his phone.
Oh, there is
They did. I mean, people got their money worth. Fine. How are you?
I can't work out. I think I'll just get out of
Yeah, and I've got David Archer's book. Archer's book, and looked at it for a while, but I must have checked out some of your book, and particularly the chapter on the play that
I'll show you the thing.
Well, my chapter's very brief, because it's kind of underground book.
You're going to get
Yeah, reading Susan. But yeah, if you're around the institute, I'm just email me.
Yeah. Have you been involved in Shelley's PhD?
No.
No, okay, that's
Oh, I don't know. No, it's writing here. So the Blair is on. It's not here either. It's on. It's in the entry. Oh right. What are you doing, Bob? What are you doing? Moving chairs around.
The institute.
What's the title?
Quantum of Play.
But other than that, I have no idea. And I mean that most sincerely.
That's very nice.
Go right to me?
Yeah, it was.
Yeah, good.
Session kind of actually speaking this up my nice rights versus outcomes, and that's quoting quite a lot from Play Return.
We moved to and but we moved to
I like the fact that you pace yourself for a good 2-day session. Not.
You get the feeling I don't get out that much anymore.
Yes. Yes.
I don't know if it's good.
There was nobody here when I know I was.
And the keyboard.
Good. Now I'm going to hear something very interesting. I won't be saying You want one? We'll see.
No, I haven't got any doubt.
Okay, that's a good one. Leave loads of room here on the door so people can get out.
Oh yeah,
Make sure people can escape. you bring popcorn? Did you bring popcorn?
No, you can bring your own.
All right.
Don't get me, throw it at you.
Any popcorn with cheese on toast. Really well. Especially in this one.
Life is a whole pile of rubbish.
I can't sit there because I can't see anything because it's light coming in the window. So I wanted to sit somewhere different.
There's a seat attached there.
Yeah, I'll sit down.
Whatever we talk about will be flying around the room anyway, so it doesn't
So
matter.
what we try to do is I'm to take this book away. Mine.
I've got one.
That book will travel.
Come out there.
We're blaming Tim Gill for that. That's
These two trying to go wrong. My mind goes blank.
No, there's loads of people here who'll be able to cut it out. You don't have to worry about it.
Speaking on the power cable and down the back or something.
Is it not working?
Yeah, it's coming on and it's warming up.
To see if it's possible to find. Okay, someone else down there.